These are the metaphysical teachings of P. L. Swan.
Hey, this is PL coming at you from my cab studio. And in this video, I'm going to just touch on a bunch of things, just kind of to introduce myself and talk about what I intend to do with these ongoing metaphysical teachings. Basically, it's going to be, there will be subjects. After this video, I'll have specific subjects that I touch on, but it will also be kind of stream of consciousness, just sharing the broad, the broad vision that I have, and, free-flowing, different styles, and just letting rip. So the essence of it is that I really feel like the problem with the world isn't, any particular view, any particular politics or religion or anything like that. It's that people are living in ego rather than spirit. And by ego, I mean essentially just the blind, instinctual, most sort of animal mind that comes into existence in our birth, in our as souls become incarnate in this dimension of reality, and this is a very simple way of putting it. Obviously, it's more complex, but there's then, of course, our soul, and whatever our intellectual beliefs, I feel like most people don't really know their own soul. People aren't intentionally, I don't know why I can't say intentionally, but people aren't intentionally seeking their soul, seeking their most essential and true self, engaging in a journey of self-discovery, self-inquiry, that would lead to what I call a state of lucidity, which is to be aware that we are a soul in an unconscious state, spiritually speaking, in this human experience. If we are not living from a soul perspective, we are unconscious in the spiritual sense. That's different than psychological. Psychologically, we are conscious beings, with a certain amount of self-awareness. But spiritually speaking, we're not conscious beings. We're in an unconscious state until we awaken, until we begin to understand we are in that unconscious state. So a huge part of my message is that we must come to truly believe that we are a soul, that we as human beings have this deeper, essential self that is transcendent of the physical experience, and we have to seek it. We have to begin moving toward a new kind of identity, a spiritual identity, instead of being so certain that our mind, our human experience is all that we are. And most people, even if they don't have an intellectual concept of this, they're just operating, living, on the basis that this is who they are, that the human personality, the human view, the human limitations, which they might not understand at all, but that this is who they are. I mean, their feelings, their desires, the small circle of their actual conscious ability to know themselves. It's just like, this is what people experience as themselves. And for most people, for most people, the idea of being a spiritual being, having a spirit, religious ideas, spiritual ideas, they are ideas. They're ideas. Most people aren't actually experiencing their more essential nature directly. they may have experienced it to some degree, and they may have learned things in terms of concepts that make them hold to a spiritual vision or a religious practice or vision. But for the most part, people are still just living from the human psychology identity and the ego identity. And we will never change the world, and we'll never truly fulfill our own selves if we are doing this. One thing I like to talk about is how spirituality is, in a sense, getting real, coming into touch with what is most real. Our soul is the most real and essential aspect of ourself. Our soul is who we really are. And we need to get in touch with this if we want an authentic experience of living and true, deep, lasting fulfillment. Another thing I like to say is, if it isn't real, it's nothing. And so this spiritual journey and this important part of my message, which is get to know your spiritual self, get to know your soul, it requires that we get real about who we are, get real about ourselves. I think one thing that gets in the way of real spiritual awakening, besides like concepts of spirituality and, tradition and religion can get in the way, but it's one thing that gets in the way is our fear of really observing ourselves. And this can be in a psychological sense as well as a spiritual sense, sometimes more in a psychological sense, that we are afraid to really admit what we are, to look inside and see everything that's there, to bring it out, to observe it, to balance it and integrate it. Carl Jung, the depth psychologist, used the term the process of individuation. And I've always understood this as sort of the process of becoming who we truly are, of integrating all the aspects of ourselves. And this is so necessary. A spiritual journey, as well as just a journey of self-growth, begins with being willing to look inside and see who we truly are and accept who we truly are. All that is there. No matter what it is, no matter how scary, no matter how dark, no matter how twisted, no matter how weird, we have to look inside and we have to see all that is there. Of course, that doesn't mean we do anything. There's two entirely different things there. One is that we observe what's within, that we observe all that we are, that we accept it, and then it's a different thing how we act, how we behave, how we relate to others. This process of individuation, this observation of our true and full nature, has to take place consciously so that we're not harming ourselves or others. So action is a different thing. But when it just comes to feeling and observation, there are no limits. We should have no fear of nakedly and honestly observing all that is within us. That's the beginning of awakening. We cannot awaken unless we're willing to begin there. Sort of as an aside, something I will develop later, but one thing I've been thinking about is that being on a spiritual journey does not mean we can escape just basic psychological growth. Part of a spiritual journey, part of awakening, is to just be honest psychologically, just to have a bit of, idea about your own psychology, about your own nature, at just a basic, human psychology level, about what you really feel, about what you really want, about what you really mean and what you're really going for. Just some basic honesty about who you are, and that's one thing, sadly, that's lacking. People sometimes, they're in complete denial of what they really want and what they are really going for. So it begins with ourselves, and we have to incorporate, just basic psychological honesty into that deepening vision of who we are, which does lead to coming to identify as a spiritual being, coming to identify with our soul. And as we do that, having a much more authentic and real experience of ourself, and then having an authentic and real experience of ourself, being able to authentically relate to others, those who also have some sense of who they truly are. And so there's that getting to know self, and then there's the relating to others, the other, you could say, as it truly is. So it's sort of this journey of authenticity, getting to know our own nature, and then coming into authentic relationship with others. But of course, you don't control, how authentic others are. So the most important thing is getting to know ourselves, and at least being able to observe reality without some filter of our own illusion in the way. If we don't know ourselves, then our own nature is like a lens, or a filter through which we observe everything else. And if we're in denial about who we are and what we are, then that denial and that illusion will affect how we observe everything else, and it will prevent us from actually being able to come into authentic relationship with the other, even if others or the other is authentically what it is. We will be unable to know it because we won't know ourselves, and so our own illusion and ignorance will be in the way of our accessing reality. So let me go to the most metaphysical aspect of this, because this applies to us as human beings, but even more so it applies to us as spiritual beings. And this is the basics of what I call the geometry of life, and it's that each of us as a consciousness is a point of experience, an essential point of experience in reality, and we as an essential point of experience look outward on an infinity of existence, and it is our ability to actually relate to reality as it is which gives us access to all that is other than ourselves. So if we aren't willing to know ourselves and get real, then we literally cut ourselves off from existence, and we literally lose life in an existential sense. And that relates to something else I'll develop over time, which is that the patterns of our human behavior and how we decide to live as human beings do affect the journey of our soul in eternity and infinity. Because if we cut ourselves off from reality in true relationship, we are cutting ourselves off from life, and in the existential, fundamental, infinite existence that's, beyond this human experience, we will literally descend into this existential darkness, which is the true hell, to be cut off from life in a sort of spiritual schizophrenia, sort of a schism from reality. That's the true hell. And so the patterns of life and death do run through this human experience, and we can see them. And the pattern of life is being real about what we are, and then relating to the other as it truly is. This kind of helps us to understand what is ego and what is soul, which is, I think, a very important question when we are trying to awaken, is understanding what is ego and what is soul. Because life comes through being real about ourselves and then relating to that which is other than ourselves, coming into true relationship, and thus expanding into existence in relationship. Because of that, let's see, I lost my train of thought. Ego and soul. So because that's the way to life, the soul always desires relationship. well, it desires authenticity, but it also desires real relationship, which means it sees what is other than itself as equal to itself always. It does not set itself apart and above what is other than itself, which is completely the pattern of ego, is that because the ego is actually so small and so insecure, it's constantly putting itself above others. And the more different something else is, the less it is to the ego. The ego makes it less and less. The more different things are, the less they have to be for the ego. Because if they're different and they're equal, then existence is big and scary. So that's a very clear pattern. The soul desires things as they are, and it wants relationship, equal relationship with everything as it truly is, everything else as it truly is. And the ego, on the other hand, is always trying to inflate itself above others. It's the most important thing. It's always in the center. Even if it's like lifting others up, the ego tends to do that in a way of, lifting up what it likes, what it's getting something from. So like if I, am dating this girl who I think is hot and sexy and I'm having a great time and I lift her up, like I help her out, I, try to make her feel good about herself. I'm doing this for myself, you could say. Even if there's genuine, affection there, it's not a selfless act. And so that's how the ego behaves, where it is always diminishing that which isn't important to itself, trying to make it actually essentially smaller, instead of just saying that's less to me. Someone can say like, well, that's not important to me. That's an honest thing. But the ego is always trying to say, well, that's actually essentially less important. That's that's not as important. That's not as good. That's wrong. Whatever. And you just see that it's such a pattern of ego. And I'm just sort of, doing a little thread through various ideas right now, and one touches on culture, how in culture, that's, in our time especially, that's so obvious that everyone has to be right or wrong. If you're on my side, you're right. If you're on the other side, you're wrong, and it's becoming more divisive. And that is definitely ego. So even if you're in the quote-unquote right, from a sort of simple, shallow perspective, you're in the wrong in that you are in the ego, and you're just creating this division and this enmity. Soul is different. Soul might discern right or wrong behavior, but it doesn't essentially judge others in this fundamental, essential way. Soul is much more forgiving and humble and accepting than ego is, because soul is humble, because soul knows how much it doesn't know. An individual soul, when we come to that essential self, our deepest spiritual self, that part of us is humble because it understands that it's part of an infinite existence, and it wants that, it likes that, because that's reality. And so soul doesn't think it can judge others in any essential way. Soul will discern certain behaviors that are harmful, and a person living from soul will certainly be creatively seeking to, create the world in the best way that it can be. But it won't be doing so in the angry, hateful, judgmental way of ego. Ego just, whatever isn't on its side is wrong and bad, and it has the right to just shut down and destroy what is bad in its view, and it has the right to judge, it has the right to condemn. That's the ego's way, and that just creates endless war, the wars of ego. I've coined this term for today's culture war, where I call it culture civil war instead of culture war, culture civil war, because even though it's not military conflict, people are just turning against each other's families being split apart because they voted for, this person or didn't support this cause. And that's all at an ego level. And as Einstein is said to have said, you can't solve a problem at the same level of consciousness as it was created, or at least it's difficult. So without that spiritual perspective that actually allows us to like sort of see from outside, above, whatever you want, and actually observe things, and see the different sides and see the tangled mess from a different perspective. Without that spiritual perspective, we are hopelessly trapped in this constant struggle where right or wrong in the, shallow cultural sense, we are still all just creating enemies, trying to destroy what is bad to us, creating war, and we're not making a place or leaving a path to real transcendent healing and unity, where everyone and anyone who is willing to change their behavior is always going to be welcome. The soul thing is so much more forgiving because it sees everyone as a valuable spiritual being, even if they're lost in ignorance. So even if they're lost in ignorance, they're a valuable spiritual being. And that, it's easy to see where someone is coming at it from that foundation of soul eyes, of soul view, and even if they're calling something out that must be changed, that is harmful, they're not doing it with that ego hatred, just that self-indulgent ego hatred. And so we have this time, culturally speaking, where we are pretty much just at an unprecedented level of culture civil war, where all over the world we're just in different camps, and it's just so unbending and unforgiving and oppositional. And there is no, as the song by Sting goes, there is no political solution. There's no cultural solution to this tangle of Gordian knots. There's no solution at that level of consciousness. We need the perspective of soul. We need this perspective of forgiveness. We need the perspective of love, and awareness, and also just the perspective of a greater perspective. There's so much more going on when you see the spiritual journey. This life is part of something so much greater. It's just part of something so much greater and deeper. And it's so important to see that. And that actually makes life better and more free and exciting and interesting and present. A person who has that authentic spiritual vision is more present. I like to say how, when people talk about religion being all about what comes after and maybe diminishing the importance of this life, that's fake spirituality. That's, the religion in the negative sense, and fake spirituality, where it's just like, it's all about what comes after, this life isn't important. True spirituality simply makes this life part of something more. It sort of like fills this life with greater meaning. And it actually gives us power and a presence, an ability to live in the moment and to appreciate the moment, which makes us appreciate this life more. It makes us feel this life more intensely. That's the beauty of true spirituality. It actually imbues this life with so much more meaning and feeling, and we appreciate it more. We are more present here and now and appreciative of the experience, of this human experience as a spiritual being. My battery's low, so I was planning to wrap this up anyway. And so moving through these various things I'm just touching on briefly here that I will develop along with, a whole host of other things over the course of time. I just want to invite anyone who sees this to just to consider that this is my perspective as someone who has, through whatever means, a lifetime of seeking, gained a certain amount of lucidity where I can see certain things from a spiritual perspective. And that's what I want to share. Not everyone will get something from this, but I know that there are those who are seeking something authentic, an authentic spiritual vision, that's not afraid of what we really are, that's not afraid of, how we really feel. My spiritual vision has nothing to do with like the surface of what a spiritual person should look like. Someone could be a ragged wanderer, a kid in their room playing video games. Someone could be, on Pornhub or, meditating in a Buddhist monastery. There are so many paths to which we find our soul. The most important thing is that we get this little awareness that maybe that's not just a story. Maybe I actually have an essential self, a soul. Maybe my consciousness, my feeling of self isn't just a product of mind. Maybe it's actually real. And then we start to seek that in these various ways. And I'll talk about various ways. Meditation is one. I think meditation, when we really understand it as clearing and quieting the mind so that we can experience our essential self or soul, that's how I see it. I think it's very important. But there's other things, substances such as, marijuana or mushrooms and stuff like that, they can play into it. Even fantasy stories, opening our mind to possibility, just contemplation. There's many different paths, and it definitely looks at least somewhat different for everyone. And some can look more traditional and some not. But what I would like to invite people to do is to consider that you really are a soul, that we are souls in a human experience. This human experience is real. It's not an illusion, but it is just a small part of something much more essential and lasting. And that to get in touch with your soul, your true, most essential self, and then to relate to reality in its infinite variation, as a human being to the best of your ability, and then as a soul, that is the path to life. And again, we'll touch on various concepts, including like the geometry of life, where I talk about the broader, deeper sort of metaphysical structure of existence. But all of that really begins with just saying, yes, I think I really am a soul, that there's this more essential me, this I, that I should seek, that I should identify with, and then moving forward from there. Thank you for listening. There will be more to come.